Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We're here today as we conclude National Human Trafficking Prevention Month to examine the state of trafficking in persons around the world. I'm Marty Flax, Director of the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS and Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism. For the first time since the UN Office on Drugs and Crime started collecting data on trafficking in persons, the organization found a decrease in the number of detected victims globally from just under 50,000 detected victims in 2019 to just under 47,000 in 2020. This sounds at first glance like it should be a good news story, but in fact these figures demand further interrogation, especially when we look at figures coming out around global estimates of modern slavery, more than 50 million people around the world. And so we need to understand where these numbers come from, and in particular what impact the pandemic had on the phenomenon of trafficking, both by limiting the ability of traffickers to find their victims and move them across international borders, but also in making it more difficult for law enforcement and for public service organizations to discover, document, and protect victims. A particularly poignant finding from a report that we'll discuss today, the UNODC's new Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, is the fact that most trafficking victims save themselves. They self-identify and they find assistance rather than being identified by external actors. The strategies that we've developed over the years to tackle human trafficking have come a long way, and we've made significant progress, but these figures and these findings reveal that we still have a very long way to go. And so we're delighted to have with us today a group of experts, both from UNODC as well as the US Department of State, to talk about where exactly we are in this process of combating trafficking in persons and their insights into where we need to go from here. We're going to start our event today with remarks from a special guest, Ambassador Cindy Dyer, newly confirmed as the State Department's Ambassador-at-Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. Ambassador Dyer is very new to this role, and we're delighted that she's on board, but she is no stranger to this issue. In fact, she's been steeped in it for more than 3 decades as a human rights advocate and as a lawyer, previously serving on the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military, Vice President for Human Rights at Vital Voices Global Partnership, and directing the Office on Violence Against Women at the U.S. Department of Justice, as well as beginning her career at the local level as a specialized domestic violence prosecutor in Dallas, Texas. Following her opening remarks, my colleague Errol Yaibuke, who directs our project on fragility and mobility, is going to lead a really important and interesting panel discussion with a group of experts on this report and their findings. We're going to open the floor after that to questions from the audience in the room, so please think about the questions you want to ask this group of experts, and we will also invite questions via our online audience. So those online can submit questions at csis.org, and we welcome your participation in this conversation as well. But now, with no further ado, I'd love to welcome to the stage Ambassador Cindy Dyer.
Thank you, Ms. Flax, for that very kind introduction. And it is such a pleasure to be here with all of you for this important event to discuss the findings of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime's 2022 Global Report on Trafficking in Persons and its implications for our anti-trafficking efforts going forward. On behalf of my office, I would like to thank UNODC, the UN Information Center, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies for co-hosting this event. This, as Ms. Flax said, is one of my very first public appearances as Ambassador-at-Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and it is an honor to be here today to support UNODC's work. UNODC is an important partner to the TIP office. They are the guardian of the UN protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, or the Palermo Protocol. Today, the Palermo Protocol enjoys nearly universal ratification with 180 states parties. It provides an important framework to 1, prevent and combat trafficking in persons, 2, protect and assist the victims of such trafficking with full respect of their human rights, and 3, promote and facilitate cooperation among states parties to meet those objectives. All states parties, including the United States, should continually strive to more effectively implement the protocol. The TIP office also supports the normative and programmatic work of UNODC. We currently provide more than $19 million to support a variety of their initiatives in 41 countries. UNODC is working in Latin America to strengthen the capacity to identify, refer, and assist Venezuelan victims of trafficking, in Honduras to train and mentor a network of investigators and prosecutors to bring traffickers to justice, and in Brazil to conduct innovative research and develop interventions that lower the rates of trafficking in the gold mining sector. In Europe, UNODC is building a network of prosecutors with mentors from other European states, while in Africa, they have been working for many years to successfully improve the legal frameworks that address human trafficking. We are also really proud to support UNODC's normative work in Vienna, which brings together country experts to share promising practices and learn from one another. UNODC is truly an invaluable partner in our work. UNODC's Global Report on Trafficking in Persons is an important resource for all of us working to prevent and combat this crime. The results of this year's report come from robust collection of and information reported by 141 states parties, including the United States. The report underscores and complements what the Department's own Trafficking in Persons report has found over the past several years, that the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the global anti-trafficking response were pronounced and significant, and that it and other threats, including conflict and climate change, continue to challenge the capacities of authorities around the world to respond adequately by identifying victims, supporting survivors, and ensuring traffickers are held accountable. Both UNODC's report and our own Trafficking in Persons report substantiate these findings and other key takeaways. Both reports note a significant drop in global convictions between 2019 and 2020. And the U.S. TIP report shows how this unsettling trend continued into 2021. As a former prosecutor, this is particularly concerning to me and means that despite our efforts, traffickers around the world are currently operating with more impunity, not less. Conflict and climate change are also exacerbating vulnerabilities and putting more people at risk of trafficking. At the Department of State, we are focused on addressing these and other root causes of human trafficking, and we will continue to assess increased trafficking risk due to both slow onset climate-related change and sudden onset climate-related disasters to better inform how governments can improve efforts to combat trafficking. Programmatically, we are also investing in ways to reduce the vulnerabilities to trafficking from climate change. We currently have 2 programs, one in Kenya and one in Bangladesh, and we look forward to learning more from them. Existing vulnerabilities are a key consideration. We recognize that members of underserved and marginalized communities face particular risks to trafficking in addition to systemic inequities they face in accessing support and assistance from law enforcement and other social services officials. UNODC's reporting on risks and identification by gender give insight into one key area of this, because norms and stereotypes around gender, gender roles, and expected behaviors affect how anti-trafficking responses have been shaped and who is most at risk. Stakeholders must consider the effects and consequences of gender norms and stereotypes when building their anti-trafficking responses. With the number of cross-border trafficking cases detected down by more than 20%, these internal vulnerabilities are all the more important. The panel speakers will go into more detail on these and other findings, but I wanted to highlight these points because they clearly illustrate how governments need to redouble their efforts to proactively identify all victims, provide protection, support survivors, prevent trafficking, even in the face of those new and complex challenges, and ensure that traffickers are held accountable. I take this call to action very seriously in my new role as the U.S. government's ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and I look forward to partnering with all of you to make sure the department can advance these priorities as robustly and effectively as possible. But I'd like to end on a hopeful note. Informed by UNODC's report and the experiences of the TIP office, amid the report's sobering findings were glimmers of encouraging courage and resilience. While the report found that governments identified fewer victims, especially children, it also found that increasingly victims themselves are self-identifying. They are escaping from traffickers' coercive control and reaching out to authorities on their own. Even when government systems drew down or focused elsewhere during the height of the pandemic, victims and survivors continued to bravely step forward. While we cannot and should not rely on victims to self-identify, and while systems globally need to do much more to proactively identify them, the strength of survivors' evidence here is profound. The department highlighted this resilience and the centrality of survivors in its 2021 and 2022 TIP reports. We continue to celebrate the adaptability and dedication of survivors and all those who combat human trafficking in the wake of the pandemic and in the face of a rapidly changing world. And we recommit ourselves to learning from survivors' experiences and bringing trauma-informed and survivor-informed approaches to all that we do. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share these thoughts. I am sorry that I am going to miss today's incredible panel, which includes Angela Meh, the head of UNODC's research branch, Ilias Chatzis, head of UNODC's Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Section, and our very own Desirée Suo Weym, the TIP Office's Senior Coordinator for Reports and Political Affairs. I look forward to learning more about UNODC's latest findings and working together with all of you to chart the way forward. Thank you so much for having me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome in particular to our friends who have come in person. It's great to see actual faces as opposed to names on Zoom screens. To those of you joining online, it's great to see you virtually as well. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Before we launch into the panel, I wanted to thank a few people. First and foremost, my friend and colleague Marty Flax, who gave great welcoming remarks. I am grateful for any chance I get to collaborate with the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS, and in particular Marty. Thanks to Abby Edwards, Lauren Burke, and Angeles Zuniga from our teams, respectively, for helping pull this off, and of course to our world-class streaming and broadcasting team who's making this happen. So, the ambassador introduced all of you, so I don't have to do that right away, which is a really nice way of starting. And I really appreciated her thoughts. Desiree, please pass on our thanks to her when you get back to the office. But I wanted to start, Ilias, if I could, with you. So Ilias, as the ambassador said, Ilias Chatzis is the chief of UNODC's Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Section. Ilias, I think you've been with UNODC for a couple of years. decades. You started as a child prodigy, probably. But you've had a few different roles, and now in this particular role that you have here, you're really understanding from the sort of UN Office of Drugs and Crime perspective, from an enforcement perspective, what the difference between smuggling and trafficking and irregular migration. I feel like some folks conflate all of these terms, and I thought before we dive in to Angela's presentation of the report and Desiree's remarks as well, I thought maybe we could just take a step back and just make sure that everybody in the room and online is on the same page. So what's the difference between smuggling and trafficking and irregular migration and other kind of irregular movement of people, and why are we so focused on trafficking today?
Right. So thanks so much also for inviting us today and for hosting this event. I think people are right to be confused because these two crimes become very fused on the ground, and it's very difficult to discern what is what. And imagine countries that are small, geographically not well resourced, and they see all these smuggling flows go through the territories with horrible crimes committed against the smuggler migrants, including trafficking in persons. But these are legally two distinct crimes. When we're talking about trafficking in persons, we're talking about one of the most serious forms of exploitation of human beings, equal to slavery, and it's for different purposes. It's exploitation for, I would call it forced prostitution, for forced labor, even for the removal of body organs from the victims. Smuggling is basically the facilitation by criminal groups of the irregular entry of migrants to a third country where they don't have the right papers to go there. So, the common element between the two, and the one that made the international community regulate against them, is also the organized crime involvement, which is quite prominent in both crimes, and which I think the report highlights quite well.
Thank you for clarifying that, and I think this focus on trafficking, this particularly vile and illegal, both in international law and just about any law, I would imagine, around the world, that's going to be the focus of our conversation here. And so, Angela May, I would love to turn to you, and I believe you have a couple of slides that we'll queue up here for folks in the room and for folks at home. Angela, you are the chief of the research branch at UNODC, under which I'm assuming you were the chief author or one of the chief authors of this really 186 page, I believe, really comprehensive, really excellent report. I did read it, and it is annotated in my office. I didn't want to bring the tome down here. But it really goes through a lot of very interesting things. You break it down in very understandable ways. For those who want to dive into methodologies, there's that. For those who just want the high-level takeaways, there's that. So if you could just give us a little bit of a flavor of what folks can find. I would love for it to be a teaser. I want everybody to go and read it. But just a few high-level takeaways.
Thank you, and again, thank you also after Ilias for organizing this event. We are really pleased to be here. So I just wanted to see, I don't see the slides. I don't know if they're on.
I think you got to go.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes. Oh, okay, fantastic. So first of all, I wanted to say in this map, you see basically the data that you can find in the report from all of these countries. You notice some of the gaps, and not for those of us that deals with information, data, and statistics, it's not a surprise that some part of Africa, but also some part important in Asia, we have gaps. So that's this to give you the reach of information and data that you find in the report. Now I wanted to show you, that's the headline, the first finding. You see here a trend of the rate of number of victims that have been identified globally over the years since we started the monitoring. And you see that there has been a continuous increase in the number of victims. I wanted to underline, this is the number of victims detected. It's not the total number of victims that we have in the world. And that brings also some, it's important to understand, to interpret these results. And you see here, you see that for the first time, we have seen a decrease of 11% on the number of victims and the rate of victims detected. And you see there on the right, the regions that have been most affected by this decrease. And you see particularly Central America, for example. And the different colors that you see there, light and dark, are male and female. Just to have a snapshot of, but you see basically almost a decrease, not everywhere, but both for male and females. So what does this mean, and how can we interpret this result? Well, this is basically the result of three issues. One is basically the reduced capacity of authorities in detecting victims. So, and we have seen, by the way, this also in other forms of crime, so it's not only trafficking in person, but there is clearly, but we have seen also in the narrative of the information that the countries have provided together with the data, so to understand and how to interpret the data. There has also been reduced opportunities for trafficking because particularly for certain forms of trafficking, sexual exploitation, for example, but also, and we see it particularly in victims of sexual exploitation, are moved in more hidden locations. So again, increasing again the difficulty in identifying the victims, find them, rescue them. And so, in a way, overall, this is a picture that shows how during COVID, we have not really seen a decrease in the trafficking, but what we have seen is a decrease on the capacity to address trafficking around the world.
Yeah, just a finer point there. A decrease in identifications, and Marty talked about this and you just talked about this, but just so we're all clear, a decrease in identifications does not mean a decrease in trafficking.
No.
Full stop.
Definitely. And we will see also, we will have a chance to discuss later, also what it means in terms of actually an increase in impunity. That's what clear it is. One of the main findings also that you see is, looking at how trafficking in person has changed over the years. Here you see the change in the typology of victims involved in trafficking in person. And you see that in 2004, when we started the monitoring, the prevalence was, the highest share was for women and girls, adult. But now you see the latest data that we have, that actually we have an increased number of men detected, an increasing number of girls, and an increased number of boys. And this is also reflected in the change also in the type of exploitations. If in 2004 we were seeing mainly sexual exploitation, now we have seen over the years an increase in the trafficking for forced labor. And that's also reflected the typology of the victims, because typically men are more involved in forced labor, and women and girls more on sexual exploitation. And it's also important to notice there on the right, you see basically the latest information, what is the share of the different type of exploitation. And you see, again, as I was saying now, sexual exploitation and forced labor basically are the same. But it's important also to notice 10% for trafficking for criminal activities. So people that are forced and exploited to undertake criminal activities. And we have seen also this on the web, on, having this. So that's really important to notice the emergence and the increase of this type of exploitation. So that is, we can start and then we can,
Can you talk, I want to turn to Desirée real quickly, but just talk a little bit about the methodology of the report.
yes.
How you got there, what you're measuring.
So basically we have, by the way, mandated, so the UN General Assembly, so all the countries in the world basically ask us to do this report on a regular basis every 2 years. And so based on that mandate, and we see also the commitment of the countries, so we collect data every year from all member states around the world, and we ask information about the victims that they detect, and the characteristics of these victims, but also, and then particularly, for example, we ask about the citizenship, all the returns of victims, so that we are able to estimate the flows. You will find a lot of maps in our report that really that shows that flows that go from some regions, countries to other regions. And so we bring together, if you want to, we connect the dots in trying to understand how this forms also of transnational organized crime forms really operates. But then we have also complemented this quantitative, if you want, hard data with qualitative data. So the report is also based on an analysis of more than 800 court cases that we have collected from more than 80 countries, to really dive into the stories of the victims and really to understand all of these dynamics on how victims are rescued, what kind of organized crime groups are behind the things, what kind of, for example, violence they are affected. All of this qualitative information that you see in the report are based on these court cases.
That's interesting, and I'm noting that the ambassador also is a former prosecutor, and so there's no coincidence. My friend and colleague Marty Flax is a lawyer. There's no coincidence that this space overlaps very heavily with the sort of legal world. Desirée Suo Weym is senior coordinator for the reports and political affairs team at the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. So her boss is Ambassador Dyer. I'm sure you are very happy to have someone in that seat to whom to report. And if you're not happy, let's just keep that between us. But I'm assuming as senior coordinator on the RPA team, you, like Angela, have some responsibility over the State Department's own Trafficking in Persons report that you produce. So what is your report? And how does it differ from the UNODC one? And maybe what are some complementary takeaways or top lines from your report?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for the question, Errol, and thank you for inviting us from the State Department to join our UNODC counterparts today. This is an important conversation, and we're really happy to be here to dig in. Yeah, for starters, let me just state by saying that UNODC's Global Report is a complement, right, to the work we are doing, the report we are doing, which covers 188 governments around the world, looking at the year-on-year efforts of governments to address trafficking, labor trafficking and sex trafficking. This differs maybe a bit slightly from our UNODC colleagues, excuse me, and their focus, which is a bit multi-year, a bit more global and regional. Excuse me. So, right, as we dig in and reflect on the State Department's report, we rely on the minimum standards that are enshrined in U.S. law to guide the assessment that we are doing. And I will note here that these largely align with the articles within the UN Palermo Protocol. So as we are going about this assessment on these government efforts, we are really looking at their ability to, and their efforts to then align to these commitments and take action in accordance with these commitments. Our report is also an annual report, so doing it a bit more routinely. And in addition, as we work through that assessment, we are considering overall whether governments are making efforts to meet these minimum standards. And so we have a ranking. That is what the report is maybe most known for then, whether governments are then meeting these standards, if they are taking increasing and significant efforts to meet them over the year. Of course, beyond the individual country assessments, we also cover thematic issues and focus on key topics of interest. And in these exact ways, this is where I want to emphasize that our report does also document many of the very same trends that our UNODC counterparts have found in their report. For example, right, the focus on climate change and how this is exactly exacerbating vulnerabilities around the world. That's something we covered and featured in our latest 2022 TIP report. So hopefully we can talk more about some of the similar findings. I think in addition on the victim identification decrease, this is one in particular I think really deserves more conversation and focus. It's especially concerning since this is the place where really government efforts should start, right, with robust victim identification. So it is especially concerning to see these decreases.
Definitely, and I would love to get into climate. I'd also love to get in, the ambassador mentioned gender dynamics, and I'd love to dig a little bit deeper on how this is affecting, Angela, your point about how this used to be really a phenomenon that was dominated by women and girls, and now it's still a majority is women and girls, but less than it was is very interesting. But before we get there, Ilias, you know, already the issues that we have talked about cover a lot of different spaces, and we all know the UN is a very big place, and there's elements even outside the United Nations that care about this issue or issues that abut, relate to trafficking. So can you talk a little bit about where this report and UNODC more broadly fits into the broader universe of who cares about trafficking and is trying to do something about it?
Thank you. First of all, as you know, this report has been coming out over a number of years. And I think the type of data that come out of this report have become so well recognized that some of the data that this report has produced have become standard in our arguments over trafficking responses. For example, the large number of victims. This report is the one that established that one third of all these millions of victims are children. And this is like, it's crazy. Second, the prevalence of sexual exploitation for women, for the trafficking of women. All of these elements came out of this report. So this report actually is the source of a lot of the responses that the UN itself is putting in place against this crime. Now, our office has also the mandate to coordinate, if I could say that, the work of all the UN agencies of trafficking persons. We work very closely with IOM on migration issues, with HCHR on refugees, OHCHR on human rights. And all of us are gathered in one group called ICAT, which meets very regularly. It has now 31 agencies. We're very proud of that. It started with 6 agencies maybe 8 years ago, and now we are at 31. So all of the UN agencies with even mandates that are not immediately relevant, but are relevant is much, for example, WHO or Interpol outside the UN system of agencies are part of this group, and we have opened it also to regional organizations. So the Organization for American States is a member, the Organization for Security and Cooperation. And this group is producing policy papers on key elements of the crime. And this is the distilled knowledge of all these organizations in their respective mandates about what countries can do in a specific area to address trafficking in persons. And there is, a whole series of policy papers that we're looking at. One of them will be now on, for example, domestic servitude and, the prevalence of that form of trafficking.
Angela and Desiree, you both mentioned, all of you and the ambassador mentioned the pandemic and how this changed things. If I could double click on that for a second and talk about what the difference was, say if we were having this discussion in January 2020 versus having this discussion now, what's different because of the pandemic? Maybe Angela, and then we can go to Desiree.
Yeah, well, as the data also showed, in a way, until before the pandemic, we were going to a story of not success, because we will never be a success until there is at least, even if there is only one victim of trafficking.
Right.
But, we would see also countries applying new legislation, be compliant with the protocol. So in a way, a story that was, would give hope. We are increasing efforts, etc. But what we have seen in the pandemic, not only the decrease that we have seen in the detection of victims, but also a sharper decrease on the conviction that really shows how much really the state has responded less to this, as Ilias said, the most serious form of crime affecting really the people. And so we had a decrease of almost 30% on the convictions, and particularly in those regions where we know there are a lot of victims. And we have seen also particularly a link between in those regions where we see more victims leaving the region, so that's where the convictions have even decreased further. So it really shows how, also the impact that when the state do not identify victims, when the criminal justice system is not efficient in addressing the problem, then there are more victims that leave the country, and we see them around the world.
Interesting. Yeah, it seems like it's moved everything underground.
Yeah.
In a really, I was reading the report, and one of the things that I found really interesting was actually trafficking was identified mainly in public spaces before, bars and streets, and of course those places weren't available as much during the pandemic, and so we sort of entered this more sort of difficult to understand, difficult to track place because of the pandemic, and of course that's why maybe these decreased numbers correlate, obviously. Desirée.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's important to focus on the data, maybe for starters, and then capacity also as a complement. So in the data, what we've seen in our global data also aligns exactly to what you all have said. So maybe just quickly reflecting on the 2022 TIP report, which covers from April 2021 through March of 2022, maybe more or less we could say the second year of the pandemic, we saw increased, I should say ongoing, let me correct myself, ongoing decreases in the victim identification numbers. So that very first year, I think we saw an 8% decrease, and then that increased again. So overall, over these past 2 years, I think we're at 24% of a reduction in the number of victims identified. When reflecting on the law enforcement side, as Angela said, yes, on the convictions especially, we saw this drop significantly over that first year of the pandemic. We did, though, in this latest report, start to see some increase back. So I think some hope there. We did have also several governments that we were able to document in the report were newly taking on efforts maybe that had been lacking for years, or maybe these were governments who had never before had a prosecution or conviction. So we do see some rays of hope in that, if I might say, and that hopefully, right, this will start to turn around. When reflecting on capacities, though, like, of course, why are the numbers down? Why is this happening? Across the TIP report, across the country narratives, the members of our team at the office, based on the information shared by governments and our many embassies around the world, really document in detail the capacity impacts that we've been made aware of. So when courts were closed for 6 months, when they were closed in certain portions of a country, right, that was clearly noted in our report, but then also, of course, that had impacts on then the ability for those cases to move through those law enforcement systems. We did, again, maybe a little hopeful note, see some governments making efforts to still continue, to still adapt, using technology, and even beyond the law enforcement side in terms of protection, finding ways to support victims still virtually or through other means, or where, say, maybe quarantines were happening or migrant workers were being sent home from a country, that then targeted screening might have happened. So I just add that as we have seen some of these signs of hope, or where governments have been able to adapt and adjust in that crisis, even with these broader health concerns, we've seen at least some of that happening.
Let's talk about climate change for a little bit, because when we think about global existential challenges, for the last few years we've been stuck in our basements talking about the pandemic, but of course there is this overriding climate crisis that gets a lot of attention. I think when a lot of people think about trafficking, their mind maybe doesn't go immediately to climate change. And yet it was a big part of this report, and I think it's a big part of what y'all, the State Department, talk about as well. Why is that?
Well, we have seen over the years that clearly the victims that are most affected by trafficking persons are the most vulnerable. Vulnerable in terms of, we have seen issue related also to mental health, but also vulnerability in the social economic status of the victim. So every time that there is affecting social economic status or health in a community, that's clearly the risk increases. And this has been documented. Not enough. This is really, I think, a challenge that we will have all of us, but really interesting to understand the trafficking person. There is still a big agenda out there in terms of research of climate change and trafficking, but has started to be documented. And we have documented in the report what in the Philippines, in Ghana, in the Caribbean islands, where big events that been, typhoon or this kind of things, where basically eradicate families, community from their places, and then that's where has been documented an increase in the trafficking. And it's interesting to notice that typically some of these events also affect communities that are engaged in agriculture and fishing. And when we look at the trafficking person for forced labor, we see that these are the economic sectors that are most affected. And so this again increased that vulnerability, particularly on the trafficking for forced labor, on those areas where we have seen clearly a vulnerability, particularly for trafficking.
That's interesting.
And maybe just to add here that I think maybe that's an opportunity also that when this debate starts, we use this discussion on climate change and how to address it as a catalyst for change, because when we do regulate industries that are among those industries that record forced labor numbers and which are the ones that are polluting, by regulating them for climate compliance, then it's a great opportunity to regulate them also for labor conditions. So once you have an entry point, it could be an opportunity to really regulate something that has been a gap for many years.
Interesting.
Yeah, and this is even a point with some focus of the 2022 TIP report as well, where, right, we talk a lot about green energy solutions, but as we build those supply chains, of course, ensuring the labor conditions are what they should be and kind of building it better, right, than before. So just wanted to complement that. And maybe in general, to Angela's comments, yes, we see, of course, exactly the same. The vulnerabilities are already there among historically marginalized communities, and these crisis situations only make that worse. Years ago in the office, we were even starting to look at this in terms of environmental degradation. So, depletion of fish stocks, leading to, forced labor scenarios in certain fishing sectors around the world. And of course, climate change is that times so much more. So yes, we're looking at this more, and we've actually included a call for information on the links between climate change and trafficking in our annual request for information this year. That is actually due today from the organizations contributing to this year's report. So this is just a very timely period for us all to be doing that reflection.
So for all those organizations tuning in today, they have
That's right. Yeah, welcome.
90 more minutes. Get on that, but only after we're done with the panel. I will flag that we will have time, hopefully, for some audience questions. So those in the room, be thinking about it. Those online, there is a way to submit questions on the event page through a Google form. Through the wonders of technology, I will receive those up here. So please do put those in. I want to talk about the gender disparities and dig a little bit deeper on that. But if I could take a point of personal privilege and ask about Ukraine for a second. We, of course, at CSIS and a lot of other folks have spent a lot of time thinking about Ukraine. And one of the things that I was particularly worried about, I wasn't alone in this worry, but Ukrainians are historically trafficked population, particularly Ukrainian women, and I was, maybe this is an indictment of my cynical nature as I get older, but I was seeing the outpouring of support for Ukrainians and this volunteerism that was really organic, and I was in the same breath really heartened and worried, because that just opens up new lines for traffickers, or at least that's what I was worried about. And so now, as we approach the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that actually a phenomenon that has borne out? I don't know if any of you are tracking this.
We are monitoring definitely, and both with Ilias and his network, with all the national authorities, and ourselves from the research side to understand and play with the data that we have. So basically, what, as you said, historically we have seen that in the past, in 2014, when there was the first kind of crisis in Ukraine, we saw a year after an increase of Ukrainian victims appearing in Europe. And so, again, if you look in the report, there is a striking graph that shows really how basically the same pattern of number of refugees, Ukrainian refugees in Europe, follow the same patterns than of victims of trafficking persons from Ukraine identified in Europe. So it's really, so we said, well, if we follow the same pattern, and before we were talking maybe, 50,000 refugees, now we're talking about almost 6 people that left to Ukraine. And so the magnitude of the risk has really increased enormously. But what happened is that, as you said, the European Union and the way how they are handling the fleeing of Ukrainian, in a way giving legal status, giving the opportunity to work. Clearly this has definitely reduced the risk, because then clearly there is less opportunities for traffickers to go and offer things that can be risky. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And so we have been seeing a little bit popping up, few cases, but definitely we are continue monitoring, because indeed it could be much more.
It's a really critical point you made there, Angela,
Yeah.
and I just want to make sure that everybody takes this away. The regularity with which Ukrainians were able to move in the European Union was a critical factor in reducing the risk of trafficking.
Yeah. And reducing also the risk of smuggling, facilitating illegal migration, definitely.
Really
Yes.
interesting.
And it's one, actually, we keep saying that, open legal pathways for migration is one of the ways to reduce exposure to crime and to opportunities for criminal gangs. And in the case of Ukraine, there was no smuggling. Or there are fears of maybe some smuggling networks smuggling people through Ukraine or using fake documents for Ukraine, but this is like small cases. In other refugee flows that we had in the past, like from Syria, from Libya, from Iraq, it has been a massive abuse by smugglers of these opportunities, and there are a lot of cases of trafficking persons. But as Angela said, it's not that there is no trafficking persons. There are already cases in the European Union and outside that are popping up, and we have to keep an eye. The biggest, challenge right now is to help Ukraine itself address trafficking persons inside the country. They're facing an existential threat, so we understand all the challenges, but the biggest challenge is to help them inside the country, help address trafficking networks and the opportunities that they may have.
The report has 11 findings, and the 6th one says war and conflict offer hunting grounds for traffickers. So I think that underscores this point. Desirée, I'd love any thoughts on Ukraine, and then since you'll have the floor, let's pivot to this gender piece, and how has that evolved over time in terms of who the State Department is the data that y'all are tracking. Are you seeing similar shifts, more men and more boys, et cetera?
Sure. So again, thank you for the question. On Ukraine, this is of critical importance. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been wreaking havoc on the lives of millions and increasing risks. And this is something we were observing and obviously clearly concerned about early on, given the trafficking risks coming from that situation. So we are closely monitoring and have been really since the beginning. It is something we've also been working across Europe on with our counterparts to understand what those risks might be, to raise awareness, to ensure that there are avenues for those at risk, those potentially in such situations to report. But as Ilias said, we are tracking already some investigations or things we're aware of. So yes, there are some situations where we know this is happening, and it's something we're just concerned if this becomes even more protracted, continues on, right, that risk will only continue to grow. Yeah. Then to your second question on gender. So in general, right, we are looking to understand the trafficking risks faced by underserved communities, right? We recognize the systemic inequities that exist in terms of access to employment and opportunity, how that can create risks. And of course, there are historically marginalized communities that have faced those. So as part of our broad work across the office and across the report, we're looking to understand what are these ongoing risks. And then in addition, right, how governments are responding. So, right, do all communities have access to justice in the same way, have access to services in the same way? But in some ways, it feels like there's still so much to unpack here and really try to understand and what is the data available. So it's something we recognize and I want to stress is critically important in this space, but that there's still so much to dig through. In terms of gender, I think for some time now, of course, we've understood that gender norms may limit, right, the access to care, for example, for men and boys. Right, and I appreciate it, I think, very much in UNODC's findings to see that noted, that, right, we all must be considering the systemic biases that there are to ensure that, you know, services can be provided as needed. And I think similarly in the finding related to convictions, was it 11? Stick with me. You know, noting how, you know, women are among those who might be convicted or at a higher rate of conviction. You know, this makes me wonder about, you know, legal support for even those who are charged with these crimes. You know, might these be victims here? Is where I'm curious of what more that data might say. So it's a space for exploration, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to go to audience questions. I'm going to go on the gender, but there's actually an online question that's related to this. So I'm going to couple it with the broader question, which is, you know, someone in the virtual audience asked how much, if any, of the increase in numbers of men and children being trafficked is due to an actual increase in trafficking, as opposed to finding evidence of trafficking that might have been missed in the past.
Oh, excellent question.
Because we have an excellent audience.
No, indeed, because that is really understanding also the nature of information that is provided. Is a fair question, definitely. You know, we have worked with few countries. We have developed. I start a little bit from far to come to answer it. We have developed a statistical methodology to estimate the number of victims that are not seen. So, and we have applied and we have worked with few countries to see and to compare what is the difference and the patterns and the characteristics of victims that are identified compared to those that we can estimate based on this statistical methodology. And we have all seen consistently in all those countries where we have seen this, that those that are less identified are national victims. You know, there is a lot, in a way, there is more bias of the national authority toward the foreign victims, but also men. And so clearly the increase that we have seen is definitely a combination of the two. An increasing of the forms of trafficking that affect more men, but also an increased attention, an increased understanding and awareness of the national authorities that they can be a form of trafficking. And we have a story and some research. Allow me to just also say that we have invited for the first time young researchers to contribute to our report. And so we had a call before the report, and you will find in the report a few of these young researchers, and one of these research is about men. And the story also on how men tell the story of how they are trafficked and how, in a way, the gender bias toward men also affect the way how they may have been seen victims.
Interesting. Any other points on gender, Ilias, before we turn to audience questions? Angeles, if you could raise your hand, and I think Stephen has a mic somewhere as well, or Lauren does. So we'll be thinking after Ilias, raise your hand and we'll get you into this.
I think that it's also one thing that is very important is that we have to make sure that, you know, countries, their anti-trafficking responses is also, they are in accordance with the profile of the victim. So it's not the same type of victim assistance and support you need for male victims of trafficking or for forced labor that you need for female victims of sexual exploitation. So these figures are quite important also in countries' responses because they have to understand the differences that there are in the type of exploitation, in the victims, that they have and how they can support them and how can they help them, stand on their feet. I think also one of the other interesting elements of this report, which is connected to this, the increasing of the forced labor and marine victims, is the fact that, as countries get more capacity to understand, more capacity to investigate and prosecute, and they understand better trafficking, then more other types of trafficking in persons that we did not see in the past become quite important. And I'm talking about the forced criminality, which is 10%. What does it mean, forced criminality? The use of a victim to commit illegal acts while they're trafficking. They're trafficked. And actually, this is the purpose that they traffic. They're trafficked for pickpocketing, for petty theft, for drug trafficking as drug mules, or the mixed purpose of exploitation. Someone who's sexually exploited, then exploited us in domestic servitude, and then it goes on and on. These were not in previous. We did not see these numbers in previous reports. So I think the capacity to understand better the crime is a positive element of this report, and it shows also that there are more things that we did not see in the past that actually could have been there over the years.
Questions from the audience? Let's go back there first, please identify yourself and brief question that ends in a question mark.
Okay. My name is Lemma. I'm from Ethiopia, and I came to US as part of Fulbright program. So I have one comment before my question. My comment is, when I read previous reports on human trafficking, I feel like the issue between East Africa and trafficking or smuggling between East Africa and Gulf countries are most of the time they are like overlooked. So because when I can see that the problem is very deep, because the smugglers, traffickers, these networks are very stronger than collaboration between law enforcement. So I'm going to read the report of Angela because I have to understand still what was happening during COVID. And my question is, you said that you had a lot of challenges to bring these reports to life because of the pandemic. And do you think in future you need new strategies to avoid the same problem? Because we don't know, there's no guarantee, maybe the same problem can happen, the pandemic, war, or something, because especially in these routes, in the journey between East Africa and Gulf countries, is very hard to do this human trafficking report because you understand the situation in Ethiopia, the pushing factor, the fragility in Yemen, and the network is very strong between smugglers and the traffickers. And when you add this pandemic on that, it's very hard to do report. And do you think you need new strategies in future to avoid these kinds of challenges?
Yeah,
thank you.
It's a great question. Let's maybe take one from this side of the room as well, in the back.
Thank you. Claudia Guidi from Department of Labor, Bureau of International Labor Affairs. So I wanted to ask about, with the increase in victims self-identifying versus victims being detected, I wanted to ask more about the legal resolution for the difference in legal resolution for victims who are self-identified versus victims who are detected by authorities. Is there a difference in how they are being treated and how what services they are being provided? So basically that. So thank you.
As I mentioned, we have a very sophisticated audience that asks great questions. Those are two, I think, really good points. So maybe let's just go down the line, and I'll go to some audience, some online questions after that. But maybe
I can just maybe agree with you. Definitely, Africa And you saw also the data and the gap that we have, also information from Africa, that makes it also more difficult to understand really the situation. Definitely, and indeed, the commitment of our next report is to focus on Africa. And so to understand exactly the dynamic that you say of the big, but one element, and you rightly, address or talk about the issue of the big, large criminal organization that exploit people, and there are in Africa. But in Africa, but also, at least from the data information that we have, there is also a lot of trafficking that is either from the family or from, that is not connected by to large criminal organization. And in fact, in the report, through the court cases, we could see, in a way, how we have indeed the most harmful, if you want, type of organization are the big organization, the ones that are organized, what we call governance type organization, those that are, if you want, the mafia type, and they exploit more victims, they are more violent to other victims, but there are also victims and a consistent percentage of victims that are actually exploited and trafficked by, single individuals, or maybe a family member, the partner that traffic the other partner or something like this. So, and it's something that is particularly also been seen in Africa. So something that definitely that needs to be addressed. When you say definitely the new strategy, one element, but I'm sure Ilias can elaborate more, is also to look at the demand. So we all tend to focus on when we see here the response of the criminal justice. So in a way to try to address the supply of the trafficking. But I think, as always, we deal, UNODC, we look at many illicit markets, and that's recurrent. You have to address side from both sides, and I'm sure Ilias, and then also the more specific question, from the research side, that's actually, I was thinking, wow, that's a good research question to take home. The court cases don't give us the information on how then later the victims are treated, but that's definitely something to take home as a question. I don't know if... Yeah.
Thanks. Let me start with a provocative thought. Trafficking is the result of the way our economic development works, our economies work. It feeds on gaps, development gaps. It feeds on destitution, on poverty, on need. That's what traffickers prey on, and these are the victims that we have in this crime. So countries which are least resourced are facing a lot of threats because of this crime. And of course the movement is from from countries which are least resourced to countries that are more affluent and where the traffickers are are trafficking their victims for the different purposes. So if we're looking about a long-term solution to eradicating finally this horrible crime that we did in the past with slavery, we have to look also at our economic development model. And I know that it goes very far as a discussion, but I think that's in the long term what we need to look at. Now, with regard to the victims, to the strategy, I definitely think we need to think differently. I'm very optimistic that some of the countries will go back to some of the, they will recover some of the lost ground, but I will be very surprised if they cover all the ground lost since COVID. And how can we then even think about asking them to do even more with the resources that they have at a time of fiscal, of a fiscal, I don't say crisis, but when there are not enough means around, when international cooperation is kind of, if not breaking down, is becoming much more difficult with all the wars and the conflicts around the world, with the repercussion of the war in Ukraine affecting countries, the fuel prices, the food prices. All of this create, I think, an environment which would be very surprised if we see positive results in the years to come. So we have to think differently. And for me, there are 2 or 3 things that we need to do. First, focus on the most important aspects of human trafficking, which is the organized crime element. This is where the big money are. This is where most of the victims are trafficked, as far as numbers. This is where most of the violence is. And that's where, the times where people get in traffic is longer. So that's what we need to focus on. Second, money generated by this crime. Where do they go? Who benefits? And this is something that we don't look hard enough into. I keep saying that if countries did the same efforts that they're doing on drug trafficking, on human trafficking, then the results could be different. That's what we need to see. And this will not happen until trafficking becomes a security threat for them. That's when I think we'll see real movement. And then third, I think we need to really look at how the crime mutates, how the crime, and I use this word consciously because it changes. You know, it adapts. We see forms of trafficking that we did not see before, and they become quite prevalent in certain regions. So we have to become very aware of what is happening, and that's why I think these reports are quite important. For the victims, I think that Angela answered it. For us, a victim is a victim. Every country has different ways of identifying victims. In some countries, they have very flexible systems. In others, they have very tight system where there needs to be an official recognition of the victim. We have to work with what the countries are giving us. So I think that's...
And I appreciated how your remarks and the report and the ambassador's statements and Desirée, what you've talked about, talks about being survivor informed and you know, because I think that's going to be a critical part of how do we adapt to an evolving challenge. The other thing I was thinking of when our Ethiopian friend was talking was, is there a role for innovation? Is there a role for technological solutions here? Of course, not a panacea, but as criminal networks, especially those organized criminal networks, are evolving, so should we. But Desirée, would welcome your thoughts on it.
Maybe just one comment here, just acknowledging in the course of our work and on our report, right, we are focused on trends kind of on both sides, right? When we talk about source countries or places from where migrant workers may be moving to destination countries, right, where they may be seeking employment. And that is something we are focused on very carefully on both sides. I really appreciated your comment and your question and for you bringing it to us. This response wouldn't fully, of course, respond to your comments, Ilias, which are, I think, very insightful and important for us all to reflect on. But maybe just acknowledging for labor trafficking, for labor migration, I think in that space, there is still real work to be done, right? In many countries around the world, we're still talking about worker-paid recruitment fees, right? That is, one piece that is already increasing risk to exploitation. We are talking about contract switching, right, where the terms of the employment then change upon arrival. This is a space where, yes, certainly some governments are starting to take action, but it's definitely a place for more of that effort if indeed these systems are to remain. So just not as fulsome, of course, as your comment, Ilias, but I think an important point for us, given just the ongoing migrations that we would expect to continue.
This question of self-identified versus authorities identified, is that something you're tracking, or it's at the very least a good follow-up research question?
Yeah, so I would welcome hearing even more from UNODC about that term self-rescue, what exactly that means. Did that mean, victims were going forward to law enforcement? And because I think then it depends on what that exactly, maybe to what you said, Ilias, what that government's response is once that victim goes to law enforcement. I think for our side, yes, we certainly see that happening, that yes, victims will come forward, but of course the recommended best practice is that they shouldn't have to do that, right? The government system should be working to proactively detect them, right? So frontline officials, whether at the border areas, whether at the hospital, in all potential places where they may intersect with vulnerable populations, that they should be able to screen, right? And that they should be aware of some of the nuances of how a victim might be then manifest in a certain situation. So we would, put the burden back on governments to be doing more to have that proactive investigation, because that really is what starts the process. I think, as the ambassador noted, right, it is helpful to hear and to recognize, of course, that that power of the voice of victims to come forward and report. I'm interested too, maybe in this place, to dig into the data more. Does that mean there was trust in those law enforcement systems in particular, right? Because I can imagine in so many scenarios that wouldn't be happening. So, yeah, ideas for more research on this.
If I may just clarify also the context of the information. This information comes from the court cases. And so basically we try to classify, classification is always qualitative information into quantitative is always, but overall that gives, and what is interesting also in that data is that indeed about more than 40% of the victims, in a way, what we call it, if you want, self-rescue, or they come to that alone, it means that there was not been an effort, there was not a law enforcement operation that then brought the victims, but the victims in different forms, in a way, came to the criminal justice system attention. But what is also interesting is that, and then is about 30% was come to the attention through law enforcement, but then there is another 30% that come from the community. And I think it's interesting because that, first of all, it shows that also communities have a role. And then how also to empower communities that are more at the front line contact with more vulnerable population, then also to work with them, to help them to identify the sign of trafficking.
That's really interesting. I work at a think tank, so any future research
it's always good.
opportunities, we're definitely here for. I'm seeing Marty nod her head as well. I think we have time for probably one more. I'll take an online question, and then just as a quick note to the panelists, I love to end these sessions with, what's your final takeaway? If you had to, you wanted the audience online and here to leave this room with one thing, tweet length, one thing, what would it be? So be thinking about that. The question from online, which is I think quite good, is can marriage be a cover-up for human trafficking, and how can institutions help victims being trafficked by intimate partners? It's kind of, I think, was buried in some of that presentation, but if you could just talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
No, in fact, that's what I was also saying earlier, that we've seen particularly in relation to domestic, what we call domestic is trafficking that does not leave the country, but is still trafficking. And we see that as, again, a form of vulnerability. Where I think why it's important to look at this is that also, as I think Ilias said, we know that large organized crime group are the one that traffic most victim, more violent, etc. And they need a response that, if you want, a strong criminal justice response. And we have all the tools also at international level for that response. That forms of violence is more close, if you want, to a response that is more relating to domestic violence, that is more closer, if you want, to the community. And then really also show the different typology of traffickers, the different typology of victims, etc. I think it's important they address the need for different responses. Because not all the responses, serve the other side. And also the need for coordination in institutions, in national institutions. So I leave it to...
I'm going to sneak in one more audience question here, because I think that was a really good answer. And maybe for the two of you, one more. We talked about institutions a bit, but what collaborative actions are being undertaken by countries to prevent cross-border human trafficking? And so perhaps, Ilias, it's from a UNODC perspective, how do you see the role of countries? And then Desirée, from a bilateral, you were the center of diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral for the United States. So how do you think about the role of countries in preventing cross-border human trafficking?
Okay. We as the UN cannot do much ourselves. I mean, we help countries, so it's countries that need to do all the work. We're there to help them, we're there to facilitate experience sharing, we're there to facilitate cross-border cooperation, informal and formal, but it's them. So the most important thing, especially in the serious forms of trafficking persons, is this cross-border cooperation, especially where they're also mixed with migration, with smuggling flows, and other types of crime. Now, there are a lot of cooperation that's happening in different countries. Where we see the weakest links, though, is in developing countries, or what we call the South-South cooperation. So usually you have cooperation, the most visible forms is between countries of origin and countries of destination. But there's an obvious disbalance here. And these forms of cooperation may not be on an equal basis. But when you're talking about countries along the same routes that are in the middle and basically see these flows coming through, there you see the opportunity and the needs actually to do more. So there's a lot of things that are happening, but the weakest links we see is in the cooperation between developing countries on this.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so for our report, of course, we see partnership as a critical way to make progress in responding to this crime. So clearly, right, starting from the law enforcement side of things, we talk a lot about law enforcement cooperation between governments when there are cases that are transnational. And often, right, that focus there is on the investigation efforts to be sharing information to bring justice, right, for those victims. But in some ways, it really is even more critical, right, talking on the victim protection side, when we are talking about partnerships, yes, between governments, especially if we're talking of these transnational cases. You know, how might a victim in another part of the world then safely get home? You know, supporting them, and we know many governments have, for example, labor attachés abroad, right, where they might support in getting that documentation or facilitating transport and all of these sorts of things. But right, there are also the critical needs for care and support for those victims. Again, in another region of the world, if that government there is not providing it, you know, what does then that home government do? So this is a space we're looking at carefully and, you know, are assessing in the reports as we have them. And even beyond when they come home, right? We talk about partnership often in the way of that very careful, close coordination with NGOs and other care experts, care providers to ensure that those victims are getting the support that they need. So just emphasizing that broader point on cooperation as well.
I have to say, I'm really inspired by the three of you. I mean, it's a really important issue set. It's critically important, especially to the victims and survivors of trafficking. You also deal with some truly horrible people in your day jobs. So that, I don't think everybody can say that so thank you for your service in this regard. Again, this final takeaway, sort of tweet length, if you want people to leave here with one thing, what would it be? Maybe we'll start with Angela and go down the line.
So what I would say, we are not yet able to quantify the size of the problem, but all the data information that we have points to the fact that the problem is bigger today than it was before COVID. And that I would also like to break the stereotype of the victim that, you know, is typically a woman, maybe from a country, from a low-income country that is exploited for sexual exploitation. And just to break that, the forms of trafficking, the typology of the victim is so diversified. And so that is
Great.
That's
a good tweet thread.
Yeah.
Excellent. Ilias.
Me, I would say that, you know, we need to prioritize. We need also to think differently, and we need to focus on the organized crime elements. For me, this is the element that we have been missing over the years in our efforts, and this is the element that really needs to come into play in our efforts.
I'll also try to be brief. So I think for me, it's about systems, right? It's about governments building systems informed by the research, informed by the trends that they're seeing, that they're then implementing, right? So, you know, we talk about victim identification. Well, having robust SOPs that are implemented, that all frontline officials are ready to use. And then, right, having a trusted system where victims can then seek assistance and not fall through the cracks. For me, it really feels like it has to be a systemic focus. And in addition, maybe one other thought on forced labor. This feels like another important piece to note. I know our colleagues spoke a little bit about it here. This is a place where we are seeing increases in the numbers of victims identified over these last years, even with the other decreases in the overall numbers identified. But still, this is a place where I think, Angela, maybe you noted, right, where, you know, in some communities, these practices are accepted, right? Mm-hmm. And around the world, we actually see governments involved in perpetrating forced labor crimes directly. So it just feels especially challenging to tackle in particular. So I wanted to just make a note on that as well.
Thank you all for being here in person. To the online audience, thank you for joining. Please join me in thanking Angela and Ilias and Desirée for a really great panel.
Thank you.